Stand at the tip of Sands Point and face the water. A white mansion rises behind you, columns catching the light off Long Island Sound. For 100 years, sailboats used it as a landmark. Beautiful, yes, commanding. But this house carried a lie, not just any lie, a literary myth so perfect, so seductive, that it survived longer than the mansion itself. The real story? Darker, stranger, more American than the myth could ever be. A clothing fortune heir builds a house and names it for buried treasure. It passes through hands like currency, millionaires collecting mansions the way others collect stamps. Then a newspaper baron buys it, throws parties that make the Gatsby legend seem tame, and claims an architect who died 5 years before construction even began designed his masterpiece. The myth takes hold, becomes fact, gets repeated in newspapers, books, tours. And here's what nobody asked. If this wasn't Gatsby's house, whose house was it? If you want to explore the hidden architecture of the Gilded Age and the families who built it, please like this investigation, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which estate to examine next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Now step back, August 1910. The north shore of Long Island stretches 20 miles east from the city, a territory of farms, fishing villages, and newly wealthy men with plans. This isn't Newport yet. No established roster of acceptable families. No gatekeepers deciding who belongs. Just raw waterfront and men arriving from Manhattan with checkbooks and architects' sketches. At Sands Point, where the harbor narrows to a knife edge and the land juts into the sound like a ship's prow, one parcel stands apart. 11 acres on a promontory they call Prospect Point. Bold land, elevated, water on 3 sides, views stretching to Connecticut on clear days. The kind of location that announces you before you open your mouth. August 2nd, 1910. The New York Tribune runs a small item, John Scott Browning to build country home on site. S. Osgood Pell & Company has sold the property. The price isn't disclosed. The buyer doesn't negotiate. John Scott Browning Sr., age 47. Treasurer of Browning, King & Company, a men's clothing chain spanning American cities from coast to coast. Not Vanderbilt money, not Astor lineage, but real wealth, retail wealth, the kind built selling suits to middle-class men one transaction at a time. His wife, Elizabeth M. Hayes Browning. The Social Register lists them among the summer residents, acceptable, if not illustrious. Browning also serves as director of the American Exchange National Bank, director of Pacific Bank of New York, the kind of board positions that signal you've arrived, even if no one quite knows when you got on the train. He names his new estate Kidd's Rocks, not for elegance, for treasure. Local legend claims the pirate William Kidd, hanged in London in 1701 for piracy and murder, buried gold somewhere along this shore. Probably nonsense. Kidd operated primarily in the Indian Ocean and Caribbean. But Americans love pirate stories, and Browning loves the romance of it. Kidd's Rocks, a name that promises hidden wealth beneath respectable surfaces. Construction begins in 1911. The architect remains unknown, no prominent name attached, no signature style. This will become important later. The house rises as a colonial revival mansion. 25 rooms, white columns across the front facade, Georgian symmetry, red tiled roof. Nothing revolutionary in design, but perfectly calibrated to its site. The approach matters. Visitors enter through the main doors and pass beneath the principal staircase landing, a compressed, low passage. Then the space explodes. The stair hall blossoms around you, soaring overhead, light pouring from above. Theatrical, intentional. From the water, the mansion commands attention, white against green. Columns visible for miles. Every captain on the Sound learns to use it as a landmark. Turn when you see the White House on the point. The cost? Never published. The workforce? Never documented. This house enters the world quietly, without fanfare, content to simply exist as the summer retreat of a successful merchant. Browning lives here through the 1910s, summers on the Sound, winters in the city, the rhythms of Gold Coast life establishing themselves, tennis on Saturdays, sailing on Sundays, dinner parties that end before midnight. Not scandalous, not legendary, just wealthy and comfortable. Then, 1919, John Scott Browning dies. Age 56. The widow, Elizabeth, tries to maintain the estate, but the mathematics shift. A house this size demands staff, maintenance, taxes, heating. Without Browning's income, the equation doesn't balance. 1921. Malcolm Douglas Sloan purchases the estate. The Social Register records him as Elizabeth's buyer. Connection through marriage to the Burden family of Muttontown. Old money adjacent. Sloan and his wife Eleanor Lee keep the name Kids Rocks for a time, then change it. After Sloan's death, Eleanor remarries Albert Delmont Smith. Together, they rename the estate Keewaydin, an Ojibwe word meaning north wind or homeward bound. Already 3 names in 15 years. The house shifting identity like clothes. 1929. The Smiths sell. The buyer will transform everything. Not the house itself, its story. Herbert Bayard Swope arrives at Sands Point Trailing Legend, born January 5, 1882 in St. Louis to German immigrant parents. His father made watch cases. Nothing exceptional. But Herbert possessed something rarer than money, energy that bent rooms toward him. By age 26, he works for the New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper empire. By 1920, he edits the entire operation. Creates the modern op-ed page in 1921. Nothing is more interesting than opinion when opinion is interesting. 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner. First recipient ever for reporting. Lord Northcliffe of the London Daily Mail calls him the best reporter in America. That's the professional Swope. The personal Swope? Legendary even among legends. He gambles. Once wins $470,000 in a single poker game against an oil baron, a steel magnate, and an entertainer. Member of the Thanatopsis Inside Straight and Pleasure Club. Precursor to the Algonquin Round Table. But his true genius? Parties. In the 1920s, before Sands Point, Swope rents a house on East Shore Road in Great Neck, right next door to Ring Lardner, the humorist and sports writer. F. Scott Fitzgerald lives nearby, a few houses down. Swope's Great Neck parties become infamous. Not invited events, people simply arrive. Irving Berlin at the piano, George Gershwin improvising, Edna Ferber, Noel Coward, Bernard Baruch, the Barrymore siblings, Dorothy Parker, Harpo Marx. Ring Lardner, Fitzgerald's close friend, sometimes checks into a Manhattan hotel just to escape the noise. Oscar Levant arrives for a party, stays 20 years. Fitzgerald attends regularly, watches the excess, the brilliant conversations at 3 a.m., the way new money and old talent collide with alcohol and ambition. He's writing something. Upstairs above his garage, at 6 Gateway Drive, 3 chapters done, a novel about Long Island's North Shore, about West Egg and East Egg, about Gatsby's parties and Daisy's dock. April 1925, The Great Gatsby publishes. Swope Keeps Partying, 1928. Late in the year, maybe early 1929, records vary, Herbert Bayard Swope purchases the estate at Sands Point, pays the Smiths. Keeps their name Keewaydin, not the original Kids Rocks. The house transforms under Swope's ownership, not structurally, spiritually. The parties that made Great Neck famous moved to Sands Point, amplified, perfected. Now the guests include the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier, Winston Churchill, Albert Einstein, Alexander Woolcott, Averell Harriman, croquet on the lawn, but not garden party croquet. Swope's version has simplified rules, encouraged cheating. He loves it. The game gives release to all the evil in you. Guests don't leave. Days blur into weeks. Nasa McMain, the magazine illustrator, and her husband Jack Baragwanath become fixtures. George S. Kaufman, Beatrice Kaufman, Mark Connolly. The parties cost fortunes. Swope's estimated wealth before the 1929 crash, $14 million. After, $2 million in debt. Does he stop entertaining? No. He borrows. From friends, from his brother Gerard, president of General Electric. Keeps the spectacle alive because the spectacle is the point. This is the Swope era. This is what people remember. This is what becomes legend. And somewhere in the retelling, a mutation occurs. Someone, impossible to trace now, suggests that maybe Fitzgerald attended parties here, at this house, on this porch. Maybe Swope's Sands Point mansion inspired the Great Gatsby. The dates don't work. Gatsby published 1925. Swope bought the house 1928 or 1929. But the story is too good, too perfect. Swope himself encourages the myth. Tells people Stanford White designed the house, McKim, Mead, and White, the architects of the Washington Square Arch, Madison Square Garden, Newport's Rosecliff. Problem? Stanford White died in 1906, murdered by Harry Thaw on the Madison Square Garden rooftop. Shot 3 times over White's affair with Thaw's wife. 5 years before Kids Rock's Land's End even broke ground. Impossible for White to have designed it. But Swope loves the story. White's name adds prestige, connects his house to architectural royalty. The myth grows. And why not? Swope's parties were Gatsby-esque. Fitzgerald was his guest, in Great Neck. Not Sands Point, but close enough. The house sits on the point like Daisy's mansion. White columns, water views. Close enough becomes true enough. Newspapers pick it up. Tour guides repeat it. Scholars debate it without checking dates. The house becomes the Great Gatsby mansion. Stand back and examine what we know. Land's End, the name Swope never used but later owners adopted, is a 24,000 square foot colonial revival mansion. 25 rooms spanning multiple wings. White painted brick and wood. Giant columns across the entrance portico. Symmetrical facade. Red tile roof. Not Stanford White's style. White favored Renaissance revival. Elaborate ornamentation. Beaux-Arts grandeur. His Newport cottages drip with European references. This house? Straightforward American colonial. The massing feels domestic, not palatial. The scale impressive, but not overwhelming. Architect? Unknown. Likely a competent local firm following established patterns. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that would survive in architectural histories, which makes the Stanford White attribution even stranger. Samuel White, Stanford White's great-grandson, disputes the claim. Researchers find no evidence in McKim, Mead, and White archives. No drawings, no correspondence, no bills. The 1910 New York Tribune article announcing construction mentions Browning and the site. No architect named. The Social Register lists the Brownings at Kids Rocks through the 1910s, never mentions White. So where does the myth originate? Most likely, Swope himself. He was a storyteller, a newspaperman who understood narrative power. Claiming White as architect elevated his estate from nice house to cultural monument, and once claimed, impossible to disprove to people who prefer the myth. The Gatsby connection follows the same pattern. Fitzgerald did attend Swope parties, did incorporate that lifestyle into Gatsby. The all-night revels, the famous guests, the sense of frantic excess, but not at Sands Point, at Great Neck, before Swope bought Land's End. The novel's geography is clear. West Egg, Great Neck for new money, East Egg, Sands Point for old. Gatsby's mansion in West Egg, Daisy's in East Egg, across the bay from each other. Land's End sits in Sands Point, East Egg territory. Geographically, it could be Daisy's house, not Gatsby's, but Fitzgerald likely never wrote about this specific house. He left Long Island for France in 1924, finished Gatsby there, published 1925, 4 years before Swope bought it. If Fitzgerald took inspiration from Sands Point mansions, he had other options. Beacon Towers, Alva Belmont's castle built 1917-1918 with actual towers, more flamboyant. Or Mary Harriman Rumsey's estate, though that wasn't built until 1928. The novel's own description doesn't match Land's End, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion. Land's End is all white, no red trim. Facts versus myth, evidence versus story. And the story wins every time. Why? Because people want the Great Gatsby to be real, want to point at a house and say, there, that's where it happened. Want geography to validate literature. Land's End provides that validation. White columns, water views, the right neighborhood, close enough. And once the myth establishes itself, corrections don't matter. Newspapers call it the Great Gatsby Mansion. Real estate listings mention Fitzgerald. Tour guides point from the water. That's where Gatsby lived. Even people who know the timeline is wrong repeat the story. Because the story is what people want. The house becomes more valuable as fiction than as architecture, but focus on the structure itself. What did this mansion actually require to function? 25 rooms across 4 floors, multiple parlors, a grand stair hall, drawing rooms, dining room seating 20, bedrooms for family and guests, servants' quarters separate. During the Browning and Sloane years, likely a staff of 15 to 20. During Swope's reign, when entertaining reached peak intensity, probably 30 or more. Maids for each floor, footmen for service, cooks and kitchen staff, at least 4 during major parties. Laundresses working constantly, groundskeepers maintaining the 11 acres, chauffeurs, stable hands if horses were kept. Below the public rooms, kitchens large enough to prepare food for 100 guests, pantries, storage rooms, wine cellars, service stairs hidden from view so staff could move invisibly, the boiler system heating 24,000 square feet, coal deliveries constant in winter, the furnace room, the size of a garage, burning fuel around the clock, water pumped from wells, electricity by the 1920s, though initial construction may have used gas lighting. Telephone lines, sewage systems handling a small village's worth of waste. This parallel infrastructure remained invisible by design. Guests saw white columns, gleaming floors, fresh flowers. They didn't see the machinery maintaining the illusion, the cost. During Swope's era, probably tens of thousands monthly, when average workers earned less than $500 yearly. Property taxes alone grew with each assessment. By 2011, 80 years later, the annual tax bill reached $190,000. Daily operating costs during the final years, approximately $4,500. That's $1.6 million annually, just to keep it standing. Without the parties, without the crowds, the house became a liability. Swope understood this. His whole life operated on borrowed money after 1929. He tried selling Land's End multiple times, pitched it to NBC for television studios, to IBM as a corporate retreat, to Robert Moses for a public park, to the Soviet government, to the nationalist Chinese, to the U.S. State Department as an official residence, no buyers. 1958, Swope dies. His widow Margaret holds on 4 more years, then sells. 1964, Horace Richter purchases the estate. The rot has already started. Not physical decay yet, but financial. The mathematics stopped working decades ago, each owner hoping they'll be the one who makes it viable. 1968, Irwin Hamilton Kramer buys it. 1969, Charles Shipman Payson and his wife Virginia Kraft Payson acquire the property. They rename it, finally permanently, Land's End. Payson money comes from the Whitney family. Serious wealth, Met's ownership level, art collecting caliber. The Paysons renovate. Architectural Digest features the estate in the early 1980s, photographed in pristine condition. For a moment, it seems saved. But Virginia is Payson's second wife. When Charles dies, estate battles follow. Whitney family money tangles in litigation. The house waits, empty rooms, cracking plaster, the roof beginning to leak. 2004, Bert and David Brodsky purchase Land's End for $17.5 million. By then, Disrepair is obvious. Peeling paint, warped floors, windows broken, wallpaper curling, the pool house collapsing. The Brodskys listed $30 million with subdivision approval. Later, $50 million. No buyers. Maintenance costs, $4,500 daily. Property taxes, $190,000 annually. The math is brutal. $1.6 million per year to own a house no one will buy. Minimum renovation estimate, $2 million. Just to make it habitable, not restored. The Brodskys apply for subdivision permits, 5 lots, 5 new houses at $10 million each, which requires demolishing Land's End. March 2011. News breaks. Gatsby Mansion to be demolished. Headlines emphasize the literary connection. The Today Show covers it. CBS Sunday Morning, the Daily Mail in London, the New York Times, Forbes, Village Voice. Preservationists mobilize. But there's a problem. No legal protection. Land's End isn't landmarked, isn't on the National Register, never received historic designation. Why? Partly because the Stanford White attribution was false, partly because no architect of note designed it, partly because the Gatsby connection is mythological. It's just a nice colonial revival house that happens to have a story. Local historians know the truth. Ray Spinzia, expert on Long Island estates, publishes the facts. Browning built it 1911, not 1902. Stanford White died 1906. Swope bought it 1928, 3 years after Gatsby. But corrections don't stop the narrative. Newspapers keep calling it the Gatsby Mansion. April 2011. Sands Point Village approves demolition. Photographer Jen Ross receives permission to document the interior. She finds emptiness. Not the romantic decay of great ruins. Just abandonment. Peeling wallpaper. Broken balusters. Floors warped from water damage. The grand stair hall silent. The room where Swope supposedly entertained Einstein and Churchill. Bare walls, cracked ceiling. Even the rooms seem to have forgotten the parties, Ross writes. The Gatsby myth promised glamour, the reality. An old house dying slowly. Costing too much, wanted by no one. April 4th, 2011. 9:15 a.m. The demolition crew arrives. You can watch from Sands Point Preserve, the former Gould Guggenheim estate next door. Pay $5 admission. Walk to the beach. Stand where sailboats used to navigate by that white landmark. Excavators position themselves. The first bite takes out the front portico. White columns crumble. Brick facade collapses inward. The sound carries across the water, cracking wood, groaning metal, stone on stone. Local resident Kathy Christie, who used to sail the Sound, destroying the home is destroying a piece of history. But which history? The real history of John Scott Browning's summer retreat? The mythological history of Fitzgerald's inspiration? The house stood 100 years, built 1911, demolished 2011. By evening, it's rubble. Later, investigators discover Bert Brodsky received fines for illegal dumping on the property. Construction debris, dumped in areas where endangered birds nested. The 5 custom homes eventually rise on the subdivided lots. Starting price, $10 million each. Total value, $50 million. The house that couldn't sell for $30 million becomes 5 parcels worth $50 million. The mathematics finally work, just not for preservation. So what actually inspired the Great Gatsby? Let's trace the real sources. F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda moved to Great Neck in fall 1922. Rented a house at 6 Gateway Drive. Mediterranean style, modest, by Gold Coast standards. They called it our nifty little Babbitt home. Scott wrote in a room above the garage. Started Gatsby there. His neighbor, Ring Lardner, friend and mentor. Their houses close enough that Lardner could hear Swope's parties from his own property and chose hotels to escape the noise. A few houses down East Shore Road, Herbert Bayard Swope's rented Great Neck house. The parties Fitzgerald definitely attended. The source material for Gatsby's excess. Across Manhasset Bay, Sands Point, the old money shore, where established families built estates and looked down on Great Neck's nouveau riche entertainers and Broadway types. That geography becomes the novel's core tension. West Egg versus East Egg, new money versus old. Gatsby's desperate reach across the bay toward Daisy's dock. But which specific mansions? For Gatsby's house, possibly influenced by several estates Fitzgerald saw, but no single model. The novel describes a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side. Beacon Towers in Sands Point, Alva Belmont's castle built 1917-1918, had towers, Gothic Revival style, more ostentatious than Land's End. But Beacon Towers was demolished in 1945, 66 years before Land's End. For the Buchanan Mansion, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial, overlooking the bay. Could be based on estates Fitzgerald visited in Sands Point. But no single confirmed model, one more source, often overlooked, Westport, Connecticut. Before Great Neck, Fitzgerald and Zelda lived in Westport in 1920. Their neighbor, Frederick E. Lewis, a millionaire who threw celebrity-packed parties at a mansion bearing striking resemblance to Gatsby's description. Lewis entertained Houdini, Ina Claire, theatrical stars. The parties were legendary. Fitzgerald attended, observed, remembered. So the true inspiration for the Great Gatsby comes from Swope's parties in Great Neck, not Sands Point. The geographical split between Great Neck and Sands Point, Frederick Lewis's Westport house. Multiple Gold Coast estates seen but not specifically documented. Fitzgerald's own yearning for Ginevra King, his lost love from Princeton, who came from old money and told him poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls, Land's End, completely uninvolved. Swope didn't own it until 1928. Fitzgerald left Long Island for France in 1924. But once the myth started, Swope's Gatsby-esque parties, the Sands Point location, the white columns, the Stanford white attribution, it became self-perpetuating. Real estate agents selling nearby properties, close to the Gatsby mansion, tour boats on the Sound. That's where Fitzgerald got his inspiration, each repetition hardening fiction into fact. Until 2011, when the house came down, and suddenly fact mattered. Historians corrected the record. Newspapers published the timeline. The myth collapsed with the columns. But here's the paradox. The myth made Land's End significant. Without the Gatsby connection, it's just another demolished Gold Coast house, and dozens have been lost. The false story gave it meaning. The true story made it ordinary. Which one matters more? Land's End is not alone. Long Island's North Shore, the Gold Coast stretching from Queens to the Hamptons, once held over 1,000 estates. Massive houses built between 1890 and 1930. The American aristocracy's summer palaces. By 2011, approximately 300 remained. The rest, demolished, burned, subdivided. Why? The same mathematics that killed Land's End killed hundreds of others. Staff costs became unsustainable after World War II. Labor unions, minimum wage laws, Social Security taxes. Suddenly employing 30 servants cost real money, not just noblesse oblige. Property taxes rose as suburbs developed. 11 acres in a prime location became more valuable, split into 20 lots, then kept as one estate. Heating bills, maintenance, insurance, liability. The 1929 crash destroyed fortunes. The Depression finished others. World War II changed social attitudes. Conspicuous consumption felt vulgar when boys died overseas. Estate taxes hammered wealthy families. Without primogeniture laws, estates got divided among heirs who couldn't afford upkeep and didn't want the responsibility. Beacon Towers, Alva Belmont's Sands Point Castle, demolished 1945. William Randolph Hearst bought it in the 1920s, made it more opulent. Didn't matter, down it came. Pembroke in Glen Cove, Marcus Lowe's estate, where Gloria Swanson and Rudolph Valentino partied. Some say these parties inspired Gatsby's, not Swope's. Demolished 1960s. The Otto Kahn estate, Oheka Castle, almost demolished. saved by conversion to hotel and event space. The Guggenheim Estates survived as Sands Point Preserve. Public ownership, not private. Old Westbury Gardens survived. Museum and public gardens. John Phipps's estate maintained by foundation, not family. The pattern is clear. Only mansions that transformed into institutions survived. Houses that remained houses died. Land's End couldn't make the transition. Too expensive to maintain as private residence. Not architecturally significant enough for museum status. No foundation money backing preservation. Just a nice house with an untrue story. Alexandra Wolf, Preservation Long Island. It's really a sad thing. The Gold Coast social country life is part of Long Island's legacy, a reminder of a grand and romantic era. But whose era? Who built these estates? Not by presidents, by retail magnates, silver barons, cable company heirs, newspaper publishers. The industrial fortunes of the Gilded Age converting capital into columned monuments, and underneath, the same invisible infrastructure everywhere. Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, German carpenters, immigrant workers building American aristocrats' fantasy. Their names rarely recorded, their wages a fraction of monthly maintenance costs, their sacrifices invisible. When Land's End fell, no one mentioned the men who built it. No memorial for workers who hauled stone, fired boilers, maintained grounds. The house became about Fitzgerald, Swope, Gatsby, about stories, not substance. Stand at Sands Point Preserve today. Walk to the beach, face the water. Where Land's End stood, 5 large houses, modern construction, clean lines, granite countertops, I imagine. No columns. The Brodsky development sold out, each house finding buyers at $10 million or above. Economically, the decision was rational. Emotionally, culturally, something was lost. Not the Gatsby mansion, that never existed, but a landmark, a place sailors navigated by for a century, a symbol of an era, even if the symbol was built on myth. Nearby, the preserved estates offer counterexamples. Falaise, Harry Guggenheim's Norman-style manor, maintained by Sands Point Preserve Conservancy. Open for tours. Medieval European castle transplanted to Long Island. Built 1923, still standing. Hempstead House, the Tudor mansion built for Catherine and Howard Gould. Also preserved. Available for events, education, tours. Castle Gould, the first mansion on the Gould estate, now the visitor center. These survived because they became public, because foundations took over when families couldn't. Land's End had no such salvation. The Brodskys tried to sell it intact, offered it at $30 million. No buyers. A house that couldn't function as a house, that couldn't transition to museum, that couldn't justify its own existence except through a literary myth that wasn't true. And when the myth got exposed, nothing remained to save. The pool house ruins lasted longer than the mansion. Roberta Feinberg photographed them in 2012, a year after demolition. Crumbling concrete, broken tiles, vegetation reclaiming the structure. A poetic dead end, she called it. No man's land. Eventually, those ruins came down too. Clean slate for development. In archives, photographs. Architectural Digest spreads from the 1980s showing the Payson restoration. Jen Ross's haunting images from 2011. Historical Society records. In memories, residents who watched demolition from the beach. Sailors who used it as landmark. Preservationists who tried to save it. In literature, the myth that outlasted the house. The Gatsby connection repeated in articles, books, tourist materials, now with corrections noting the timeline doesn't work. The truth finally told, after the house is gone. Here's what haunts me about Land's End. Not the demolition itself, tragic, but economically inevitable given the costs. Not even the myths, those are interesting, revealing about how stories work. What haunts me? The question of value. If Land's End actually had inspired the Great Gatsby, Would it have been saved? Probably yes. Literary landmarks carry weight. Government funding, foundation support, landmark protection all become possible when you can point to a house and say definitively, here. This influenced one of the great American novels. But because the Gatsby connection was false, the house lacked that protection, so its value depended entirely on myth. And when myth collapsed, the house had no defense. Is that right? Should a building's worth depend on its relationship to fiction? John Scott Browning built a comfortable summer retreat for his family, accomplished something, a successful business, a nice house, a position in society. That's the real history. Not romantic, not literary, just American success. Should we preserve only houses connected to famous stories? Or should we preserve examples of how people actually lived? Land's End represented Gold Coast architecture. Not the finest example, not Stanford White genius, but competent, graceful, well-sited. The kind of house dozens of successful families built. And now it's gone. One less example of that era. One less piece of evidence. Meanwhile, the myths persist. Search Gatsby Mansion, Long Island, and you'll find Land's End. Articles still call it Fitzgerald's inspiration, with corrections buried paragraphs down. The story proved stronger than the house, and even stronger than the truth. Let's return to the original question. Can a legend survive if the house that supposedly created it never inspired the legend at all? Turns out, yes, easily. The Great Gatsby endures. One of the great American novels, taught in schools, adapted to film repeatedly. Its images, the green light, the billboard eyes, the parties, embedded in culture. Land's End's destruction doesn't diminish Gatsby. The book exists independent of geography. And Fitzgerald's real inspirations, Swope's actual parties, the Great Neck social scene, the class tensions of the North Shore, those were real. The inspiration existed. Just not at that specific address. But here's the deeper truth. Land's End needed Gatsby more than Gatsby needed Land's End. The house required that myth to justify preservation. Without it, it became just expensive real estate, $4,500 daily to maintain, $190,000 annual taxes, $2 million minimum to renovate, no economic use, no architectural significance without the White attribution, no literary importance without the Fitzgerald connection. The numbers tell the story. The ledger always wins. Who paid for Land's End? Browning, who built it? Sloan, who bought it? Swope, who glorified it? The subsequent owners who tried to maintain it? The Brodskys who demolished it? The buyers who purchased the 5 new houses? Each transaction rationale, each owner doing the math, each decision defending itself through economics. But what was lost? A landmark, a navigation point, a piece of an era, an example of how wealth functioned on the Gold Coast, a house that was, if we're honest, perfectly pleasant, well-designed for its site, and worth remembering, not because Fitzgerald wrote about it, because it existed, because humans built it, because it represented something about American ambition and American impermanence, the irony, the myth that elevated Land's End also destroyed it. If people had valued it as Browning's house, as an example of colonial revival architecture, as a landmark, maybe different preservation arguments emerge. Maybe modest, truthful significance finds support. But the inflated myth, the Great Gatsby Mansion, designed by Stanford White, set expectations the reality couldn't meet. When historians corrected the record, the house lost its claim to importance. And 4,500-a-day buildings without importance become rubble. Stand at the tip of Sands Point today. Face the water. No white columns behind you. No mansion catching the light. 5 modern houses occupy the subdivided lots. Tasteful, expensive, private. You can't see them from the road. Can't use them as navigation markers from the water. The sound doesn't remember. Currents flow the same. Tides rise and fall. Sailboats pass, captains using GPS now, not landmarks. But the myth remains. Google, Great Gatsby Mansion and Land's End appears. Articles, blog posts, historical societies all telling the story. Some get the dates right now. Swope 1928, Gatsby 1925. The timeline doesn't work. Stanford White 1906 construction. 1911, impossible attribution. But the story persists because people want it to be true. Want to believe Fitzgerald sat on that porch. Want to point to ruins and photographs and say, there, that's where the American dream died. Except it isn't. And it didn't. The American dream died, if it died, in the novel itself, in Gatsby's reaching, in Daisy's carelessness, in Tom's brutality, in Nick's disillusionment. Not in a house, in words, and that's the final lesson. The house was never the point. The point is the story we tell about the house, the meaning we assign, the significance we claim. Land's End could have been preserved for honest reasons, as an example of its era, as a piece of architectural history, as a landmark. Instead, it lived on borrowed myth. And when the myth defaulted, the house defaulted too. $4,500 daily, $190,000 annually, $2 million to restore. Demolished April 4th, 2011. 100 years of standing, 8 hours of falling. What survives? Photographs, documents, memories, the occasional news article marking the anniversary, and the myth, somehow stronger than ever, repeated in every retrospective, the house that inspired the Great Gatsby. Even now, even after correction, even after demolition, the legend survives. The house does not. Make of that what you will.